All right, so we are recording now, and I'm going to go ahead and get this full screen. If you have any questions, just feel free to stop me. I will stop in the middle between these two chapters and check and see if you have any questions. But these are pretty quick chapters on balance and rhythm, and I think we can get through them pretty quickly. So first we're going to take a look at balance. This is a really beautiful drawing or painting, and it's called Funeral Under Umbrellas. And it's a great way to start talking about balance because it shows you how an artist can handle the distribution of visual weight in a composition. So here we have all of the figures and almost everything happening on the right side, but the left side is basically empty. And what keeps this from seeming extremely off balance is the diagonal rain and the lines that extend across. They cross over that left side that curves, right side that curves to the left, and the diagonal rain crosses over and drags our eye down and to the right. So even though this is technically, an unbalanced composition, there are techniques you can use to make it appear more balanced and to keep the viewer from having this, sense of unease. Because as people, we like things to be balanced. So when we talk about balance, and if you critique something, you are talking about the distribution of visual weight. So the dark figures and all of that detail in that line of umbrellas adds visual weight. So it's definitely weighted to the right. When we talk about balance, we can think of pictorial balance. And we, as humans, always assume that there's a center vertical axis, and then we expect to see some kind of equal weight on either side of that vertical axis. And this axis functions as a fulcrum on a scale or a seesaw. And we want the two sides to achieve some kind of equilibrium. You can think of equilibrium as being the visual balance between two opposing elements. So if both sides feel balanced, even if they're not exactly the same, they've reached an equilibrium. Then if equilibrium is lacking in a piece, that can kind of give the viewer a sense of unease or dissatisfaction. And it's important to remember this as a tool because there could be times when you don't want the viewer to be extremely comfortable. So perhaps your message is, one of a social crisis or politics, or as in this one, it is a piece of fine art, and but it has it wants you to think about a certain concept. So this is Philip Guston, and in this painting, which is called Transitions, it's really weighted to the right. Even the hands of the clock are like pointing over to the right and up towards this mass of kind of vague forms. We're not quite sure what they are. And the off-balance shift in weight seems in keeping with the title. A body off balance tends to be in transition until balance is reached. So we can tell that there is some kind of a body involved by the hands there also hanging on. So there's a sense that there's imbalance or something is happening. So the whole feeling of this painting is one of a little bit, something's happening that probably isn't super comfortable. And so that's the way that the artist has used this idea of balance or lack of balance to convey an emotion or a feeling. And then this just reiterates what I just said. There's a tension here. When you have more weight on the bottom, things tend to be and feel stable. If you have a lot of weight on top, it feels more dynamic, like things could topple over at any moment. There's basically 4 types of balance that we use in composition. There's symmetrical balance, asymmetrical balance, radial balance, and crystallographic balance, or all over pattern. So we're going to just go through and take a look at these 4 types of balance. So the one that the human viewer likes a lot is symmetrical balance. I'm going to turn to the description of this. So shapes in symmetrical balance, you would repeat shapes and colors and other texture on both sides of a vertical axis, and they would look almost identical. This is also called bilateral symmetry. And in effect, one side becomes the mirror of the other. And symmetry is really high on the list of universally recognized attributes ascribed to beauty. So they've used this picture of Audrey, these 2 pictures of Audrey Hepburn to illustrate that. She's, of course, considered one of the great beauties of film. And on the left, you can see an unaltered photograph of Audrey Hepburn. On the right, they've taken half of her face and flipped it horizontally to make it exactly symmetrical, bilateral symmetrical. And you can see there's some oddness in her hair, and it sort of widens out her face. But when you look at her eyes and her nose and her lips, you can see how closely in real life Audrey Hepburn was bilaterally symmetrical, and hence thought of almost universally as a great beauty. It's really interesting to try this yourself, and you can do it pretty easily with Photoshop, to take a picture of yourself and divide it in half and flip one half horizontally and place it over, line it up and cover the original half of your face, and see what you look like with perfect symmetry. It won't even look like you. This is the simplest kind of balance to recognize. Basically, as I said, things are repeated left and right. It is very formal, and so you'll see symmetrical balance in architecture quite a bit, and especially in religious places of worship, government offices, other places where the architect is looking for a sense of formality and stability, and to give the people who enter these spaces a sense of power and trust and permanence. It's also called classical balance, and can be considered sedate and dignified and unified. And this over here is Bernini's The High Altar and Chair of St. Peter's in the Vatican in Rome. Now, artists like to play with things, of course, and symmetry is something that more than one artist has played with. And this is Ed Rushka, Step on No Pets, where he has taken a mountain and essentially done the same thing that the photographer did with Audrey Hepburn's face, just duplicated it right down the middle so that it is repeated on both sides. And then the artist has also used the palindrome, the Step on No Pets, which reads the same left to right as it does right to left. So that is kind of the verbal equivalent of bilateral symmetry. So here the artist has used it twice. We see a lot of symmetry in nature. As we go along, you'll find another common type of symmetry that we see a lot in nature, and that's radial. And here, symmetry became the point of the whole composition. And then you move on to the second type of balance, which is asymmetrical. And that's where you have things that aren't identical on either side of a vertical axis, but are still balanced. So in this one, this sculpture, the artist has used color and shape to balance this sculpture. So there's the two black pictures on the left are balanced by the big black shelf on the right bottom, and also the smaller red bottom of the shelf is balanced by the larger red boxes on the right. It's thought of as a more informal type of balance, so things don't feel as sedate. And the end result is that you want, even though things are not the same, you want them to have a sense of being, having the same amount of weight. So if you think of a seesaw or something like that, you would want, even though if you're piling up different types of objects on either side, you want it to be balanced in the end. So here's an example of a photographer who used asymmetrical balance to create a portrait that is less formal. The artist, the subject is not dead center, but because of the way her hand and the cigarette are positioned, you have a sense that there's balance here, and it adds a little more interest than just having her static in the very middle of this portrait. It's a little bit harder to create. You have to really think about it, and you may have to experiment. This is where kind of posting a draft up to the class can come in really handy, because they'll give you some feedback on whether or not your composition or your attempt at asymmetrical balance is working. So some of the ways that you can achieve asymmetrical balance would be you can balance by value or color. And here you see a really large, oops, hold on just 1 second. There we go. Sorry for that interruption. So on this side, on the right side, we've got a large rectangle with texture. And amazingly enough, it is balanced by this really dense, smaller square of black on the left. Oops. Okay, what's happening now? Okay, I'm going to pause again. I'm not sure what I... Okay, so you can balance by value or color. You can balance by texture and pattern. Oh, no, why isn't it going forward? My goodness. Let me see. There we go. Balance by position and eye direction. I think we have examples of all these. So here's value and color. So you have this large expanse of yellow, and it's balanced on the left by these small, more intricately shaped areas of dark. So this kind of thing, even if you're not trying to depict something realistically, can really work if you say you have a lot of text over here on the right and you want to balance it over on the left with some kind of illustration. Something like this could work really well. So contrasting light and dark, you can balance a large area of dark by a bright color. And conversely, you could do the opposite. And our eyes are attracted to color as humans. So we're going to look at the color first and then black and white. So we see that big expanse of yellow, and then we find the smaller areas and the smaller shapes of black and white. You can also utilize the areas between contours of a shape, like a silhouette. And here the silhouette is white, but normally, we're more accustomed to seeing black silhouettes. If you use value and color as a balance tool, it gives you a lot of flexibility. It allows a large difference of shapes on either side of the center axis, and it still allows you to achieve equal eye attraction. Here are some examples of balancing by texture and pattern. On the left, we have these large rectangles. The top one has quite a lot of texture, but it's balanced pretty well on the right by a smaller shape that has the same texture, but is a much more random and organic shape. So our eyes are kind of drawn to those organic, irregular shapes. Texture will draw the eye more than a smooth, flat color. So down on the bottom there, that even though that large rectangle of gray is kind of dominating the left side, our eye is drawn to that more intricate, textured, smaller square on the right. So those two balance each other out. And there it is. I haven't gotten this down to where I'm talking at the same time as I'm clicking. So a large shape can be balanced by a smaller textured shape, and texture can be balanced by a more complex shape. Here's an example of an artist. This is a print. You've probably seen this by a Japanese artist. And here we have this large mountain on the right, dominating the right side, but it's really nicely balanced by that pattern of clouds over to the left, along with the pattern that suggests trees on the right. And the color of the mountain is balanced by the texture of the water, which I didn't see as water. I saw it more as trees, but anyway, it's balanced by the texture. You can also balance by directing the viewer's eye, or by having something in your composition if you're painting or a photographer that utilizes eye direction. When we think about this in terms of physics, if you wanted, you'll have a fulcrum, if you remember back to your physics classes. If you want to balance two objects with different weights, you put the larger one closer to the fulcrum, the center. So here's an example of kind of an asymmetrical design, but there is balance achieved because the artist is drawing our eye around this composition and doing it in a number of different ways. There's a lot of activity, a lot of weight over on the left, but there's a definite gaze between the two subjects in the middle and to the right. They're gazing at one another. And so we have that connection, which is reinforced by the curved arches, which take us kind of back and forth from left to right. In this photograph, it has a very serene, kind of formal, not formal, but serene, relaxed look to it. And so we feel that it is balanced, but it's balanced asymmetrically. So the photographer has placed things in a certain way to balance top to bottom and left to right. But it definitely has an informal look to it. And just remember that even though we kind of analyze all of these design principles one by one, most of the time you're incorporating more than one principle or more than one technique. Here we've got balance going by color and contrast. We've got shape and size being used, so even weights. We've got texture and contrast being used. So there's more than one thing going on. The third type of balance is radial balance, and you've all seen a lot of it in both nature and art. And that's when all of the elements radiate out from some central point. Here's a picture or a photograph or an X-ray, I'm not sure what that is, of an object, a natural object. And you also see a lot of radial balance in jewelry and ceramics. In cultural symbols, I'm sure you've seen mandalas. And let's see, architecture. So domed buildings like the Capitol will almost always give us a radial feeling in the interior. And sometimes these designs have, they want you to give your focus to the center. And so this is an example of a radial design by Damien Hirst. And then down below, it's just a little section of piazza that illustrates how urban planners will often use radial design, sort of emanating out from the center of town. Commonly used in Tibetan mandalas, rose gardens. And then the last pattern, the last type of balance that we often see is called all-over pattern or crystallographic balance. So it is balance that has equal emphasis over the whole format. So not any one element is emphasized over the others. And it's just easy to remember by thinking of all over pattern. It's a symmetrical balance that constantly repeats. And that concludes chapter 5 on balance. Let me end this recording.